Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our speaker series, From the New Archaeology to Equitable Archaeologies, Global Lessons from Black Scholars. I'm Martin Menz, a PhD student here at the University of Michigan on the traditional lands of Anishinaabe, Wyandot, Miami, Sauk, Fox, and others. I want to acknowledge the early and ongoing entanglements of the history of this university with Indigenous and Black communities. To quote the words of historian Ty Miles, the University of Michigan was born out of a compromise made by Native people in the context of a century of colonial warfare and land dispossession in the Great Lakes. It was built on ill-gotten lands and funded from the wealth derived from slave labor. With this, we'd like to recognize the 1817 treaty at the foot of the rapids with the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and reaffirm their ancestral and contemporary ties to this land and the contributions of both Black and Indigenous people to this university. I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. Ayana Flewellen, an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of California, Riverside. Dr. Flewellen is a Black feminist, an archaeologist, a storyteller, and an artist. As a scholar of anthropology and African diaspora studies, her intellectual genealogy is shaped by critical theory rooted in Black feminist epistemology and pedagogy. This epistemological backdrop not only constructs the way that she designs, conducts, and produces her scholarship, but acts as foundational to how she advocates for greater diversity within the field of archaeology and within the broader scope of academia. Flewellen is the co-founder and current president-elect of the Society of Black Archaeologists and sits on the board of Diving with a Purpose. Her research and teaching interests address Black feminist theory, historical archaeology, maritime heritage conservation, public and community engaged archaeology, processes of identity formation, and representations of slavery. She has been featured in National Geographic, Science Magazine, and PBS, and regularly presents her work at institutions, including the National Museum for Women in the Arts. Today, her talk is titled The Will to Adorn, Black Women and Sartorial Practices Post-Emancipation. Before beginning, a few quick notes on today's technology. First, viewers have the ability to turn live transcripts on and off. Throughout this lecture, you are welcome to utilize the Q&A function to ask questions and upvote those asked by others that you would like to see answered. We will turn to these questions at the end of the presentation. With that said, I will now turn things over to Dr. Flewellen.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that introduction. And it's so great to be in conversation in this series with several fantastic Black scholars who are doing phenomenal scholarship around the world. Let me share my screen. So as Martin outlined in my bio, I'm the president-elect of the Society of Black Archaeologists, a board member of Diving with a Purpose, and I serve as the co-PI of the Estate Little Princess Archaeology Project on the island of St. Croix. I'm also doing a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work through SBA that has grown rhizomorphically in exciting ways. And I welcome the opportunity to share more about that work during the Q&A. A few things that should be on your radar. The SBA is in collaboration with the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, Cornell University, Sapiens, and the Wintergrand Foundation have our second to last installment of our webinar series, From the Margin to the Mainstream, Black and Indigenous Futures in Archaeology. And Michigan's Museum of Anthropological Archaeology is the co-sponsor of this event. Also, Diving with a Purpose, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the oceanic conservation and preservation of submerged heritage resources, has been in the media a lot lately, and I just wanted to highlight that the co-founder, Ken Stewart, was recently featured in AARP. And SBA is currently part of a fundraising campaign in partnership with Hulu. And if you haven't already seen the fantastic episode of Your Attention Please, featuring the co-founder of the SBA and current president, Justin Donovan, please get on it. And finally, in collaboration with several academic archaeology centers around the country, including Michigan's Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, under the directorship of Adam Smith from Cornell University, we've created a survey titled Identifying the Hidden Cost of Archaeology Field Schools. And this survey really seeks to really seeks to gather information on student experiences with managing the financial cost of archaeology field schools, including the experiences of those who were unable to attend a field school because of cost or other exclusionary factors. And in particular, we're seeking to understand how hidden costs may be making participation difficult, creating a roadblock to a fully inclusive discipline. And our shared goal is to find ways to really improve student experiences in the diversity of this research and of our field for the next generation of scholars. And today, I want to invite you all to be in a space of intellectual play with me as I share concepts and ideas that I'm sitting with, tossing around and really ironing out. There's sort of gritty spaces of experimentation that we so often don't share or get to witness with others, but are essential to any project and any book. So please journey with me. This presentation centers on the research undergirding my current book project, which examines how dress was central to processes of identity formation of African American women in post-emancipation Texas. By illuminating how quotidian sartorial practices Black women engage were critical to the ways they navigated the precarity of African American life after enslavement, the book examines Black women's identity formations during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Quotidian dress practices, unlike formal or costume dress, seen in Sunday best, funerary, and carnival wears, are often overlooked and understudied. Yet, it's within these everyday practices that Black women's ability to chart a path through the day-to-day racial sexual oppression they endured and the spaces of possibility they created within dire circumstances becomes legible. We know so little about the everyday lives, tastes, preferences, decisions of Southern African American women who lived through the post-emancipation era in the United States. Yet, the material remains of these everyday sartorial practices contain rich evidence of who these women were, who they wanted to be, and how they wanted to be seen. So wanting to follow in tow with the theme of your department's lecture series, From New Archaeology to Equitable Archaeology's Global Lessons from Black Scholars, I thought I'd share more about the epistemological underpinnings of the book project, which ground itself in Black feminist theory. When I envision equitable archaeologies, I imagine breadth, the expansion of our discipline that for so long has disavowed Black epistemologies and has not worked to create sustainable avenues for the recruitment and retention of Black students and professionals in our discipline. In an era where more and more research is being conducted at African diasporic sites, it becomes that much more imperative for our discipline to be in conversation and in collaboration with Black studies scholars who are on the cutting edge of new formations of knowledge, innovating creative ways to study the richness of Black lives in the past, present, and future. The futurity of our work and our discipline depends on this. As I will share, Black feminist theory breathes life into new avenues of archaeological research, focusing on historicizing the positionality of past individuals to provide a more nuanced understanding of quotidian life. Through an exploration of my research, this presentation really aims to outline the flesh and texture of Black feminist archaeology, discussing its theoretical and methodological contours that work to illuminate the lived experiences of past African American women through centering various facets of their identity, including race, gender, class, and geographic location. My own work maps and expands upon the work of brilliant Black scholars like Zora Neale Hurston, to whom the title of this presentation harkens, as well as other brilliant Black feminist scholars like Jessica Marie Johnson, Marissa Fuentes, Cydia Hartman, Tina Camp, Kevin Kwashi, and Gabrielle Seville, whose scholarship has deeply shaped how I come to play with both material and documentary data within this project. This book opens with Hester Holmes. This book opens at the center. Amid racialized servitude, sexual exploitation, and economic disenfranchisement that marked the post-emancipation era in the United States, African American women like Hester Holmes were styling their hair with combs, lacing glass beads around their necks, dyeing coarse cotton fabric with indigo berry and sweet gum bark, and fastening buttons to adorn their bodies and dress their social lives. What would it mean to shift the lens through which we explore the post-emancipation era to center on the lives of Black women who, like Hester Holmes, formerly enslaved, racialized as Black, and engendered as women, lived during a period of monumentous transformation, bookended by the unraveling promise of Reconstruction? At the intersection of race, gendered, and class operations of power and oppression that undergirded the precarity of African American life during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was Hester Holmes, completing her daily task as a domestic servant, cooking, cleaning, laundering, and mending clothing for the Jordan family in Brazoria County, Texas. She then returned to her own cabin to do homekeeping work while perhaps even maintaining her own garden for subsistence needs. Within my research, dress practices Black women engaged in post-emancipation Texas are used to examine how processes of racialization, sexual exploitation, and economic disenfranchisement intersect, shaping formations of identity. So through a synthesis of documentary, oral history, and material culture data, this project investigates why African American land-owning tenant, wage labor, and sharecropping farmers in rural post-emancipated Texas engaged in particular sartorial practices. In this book, I ask, in what ways were sartorial practices embedded in relations and ideologies of race, gender, and class? And how did African American women negotiate these operations of power and oppression through dress? As African American women and as African American women move through various spaces at home, at work, and in the public during a time of heightened racial oppression, how were their choices regarding dress influenced? How were their choices of clothing and adornment situational to the spaces that they occupied? In the book, I argue that everyday sartorial practices, how people dress their bodies for their everyday lives, are quiet spaces of self-baking through their repetitive daily engagement, constitute the body and form new identities. I'm playing with conceptualizations of quiet from Tina Camp's Listening to Images, where she introduces listening as a methodology to explore the frequencies imbued in photos of African and African diasporic people, and the work of Kevin Kwashi in The Sovereignty of the Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, where he explores the richness of Black interiority akin to Toni Morrison's interior lives by shifting the lens of our study towards Black practices that are overlooked when the oversaturation of Black studies tends to center on Black expressive culture solely formulated through the reductive lens of resistance or conformity. Both Camp and Kwaji, in similar veins, posit that everyday practices Black people engage resonate at such a frequency that scholars must attune their analysis to capture the fullness of these quiet practices. And Camp reminds us that the quotidian or quiet practices, quote, honed by the dispossessed in the struggle to create possibility within the constraints of everyday life, end quote. The everyday, and more specifically, everyday dress practices of African American women are conceptualized as quiet in the book project. And quiet is the modality of the quotidian within this work. It is the articulation as a mode, it is articulated as a mode through which the everyday workings of Black life is made legible beyond the dominant binary paradigm of conformity versus resistance. And it's so often that this dominant paradigm oversaturates studies of African American women's dress practices and leaves the everyday overlooked. However, it's these quiet practices, often taken for granted, that demonstrate the complex ways African American women maneuvered racialized, gendered, and class operations of power and oppression while creating lives of possibility for themselves. Building off of the work of Mary Ellen Rosh Higgins and Joan B. Etchner, I define sartorial practices as social cultural practices shaped by many intersecting operations of power and oppression, including racism, sexism, and classism that involve modifications of the corporal form. So think about scarification, body piercings, and hair alteration, as well as three-dimensional supplements that are added to the body. So think clothing, hair combs, and jewelry. The emphasis on intersecting operations of power and oppression draws on intersectionality articulated by Kimbrough Crenshaw, which rests as the basis of Black feminist theory, which is canonized by Patricia Hill Collins, both of which ground my research questions. And within the book, I really worked to deepen my engagement with Black feminist theory by articulating the intricacies of processes of racialization, exploitive capitalism that laid at the foundation of wage and sharecropping families' engagement with the Southern farming equality and practices of sexual exploitation Black women face in the fields as agricultural workers and within the homes of white families that employed them. Through deepening my engagement with Black feminist theory, through striking a balance in the combination of both quantitative and qualitative analysis of material culture and documentary sources of data. The book takes shape within the disciplinary blurring work of Zora Neale Hurston, stitching together a methodological interdisciplinary tapestry that articulates Black feminist archaeology at the interstices of digital humanities, historical archaeology, and Black feminist theory. So the book focuses primarily on artifact assemblages consisting of clothing, adornment, grooming, and clothing maintenance artifacts recovered from the Levi Jordan plantation. And the Levi Jordan plantation is located in Brazoria County, which is located about 60 miles south of Houston, Texas, between Medjugorje County and Galveston County along the Texas Gulf Coast. By 1848, when Levi Jordan arrived in Brazoria County to establish his sugar plantation, the area already had a strong plantation economy based on sugar and cotton production. The county's location along the Texas Gulf Coast provided easy access to Atlantic waterways for the transportation of goods and people. As a result, Brazoria County, as a port county, provided shops in the region access to a wide variety of goods, both nationally and internationally, for purchase by both Black and white residents during the antebellum and postbellum eras. Archival research has revealed that African Americans that lived at the Levi Jordan plantation bought goods from the Jordan store, as well as from other shops in Brazoria County with cash and store credit. Archaeological research at the Levi Jordan plantation encompasses over 3 decades of work and a number of people and organizations. Most notably is the work conducted by Kenneth Brown, an associate professor at the University of Houston, who excavated the plantation, from 1986 to 2006. Since 2002, the site has been state-owned with plans under the direction of the Texas Historical Commission to transform the plantation into a premier public heritage site for the interpretation of slavery in the state of Texas. During the tenure of Brown's work, he located a number of structures at the site, and the image on the slide really outlines these structures in red. The main house, barn, detached kitchen, and to the south of the plantation, 4 cabin blocks were recovered that housed the enslaved and later tenant farmers who labored at the site. 3 of these 4 cabin blocks housed 6 individual cabins aligned in 2 columns, while 1 block housed 8 individual cabins aligned in 2 columns. And a total of 19 cabins had at least 1 excavation unit placed in them. However, for the purposes of this book project, I really examined artifacts from the 7 most extensively excavated cabins located in blocks 1 and 2. The Levi Jordan plantation assemblage, now housed at the Texas Historical Commission's Archaeology Storage Facility, is an example of what some in the field call a legacy or orphaned assemblage, a large collection of material culture that has not been examined since 2002. Collections like the Levi Jordan plantation assemblage raise ethical and intellectual dilemmas within the field, as state facilities are overflowing with material culture primarily recovered through cultural research management firms that are minimally studied. Pulling from Whitney Battle Baptiste, author of Black Feminist Archaeology, she states that re-examining of artifact assemblages pertaining to the African diaspora is a Black feminist project, stating, quote, "It remains essential for us to look back, reflect, and at times even alter sites that were excavated and interpreted in the past," end quote. Dr. Kenneth Brown's work at the Levi Jordan plantation resulted in the recovery of over 600,000 artifacts related to African American life during the antebellum and postbellum eras, making it the largest collection of its kind in the state of Texas. While he and his students produced a few articles and an MA thesis based on the assemblage, primarily before the completed excavation of the site, all of this work has generally focused on the era of enslavement with little discussion regarding the experiences of those who lived and labored at the site after 1865. The book project takes up Battle Baptiste's call for a re-examination of a collection rich in material culture data that can tell us more about the lived experiences of African Americans in post-emancipated Texas. However, this of course is not without its own complications. Moving into the methodology, specifically when re-examining orphan collections, one of my first goals with working with this site was really to establish a chronology of the site. And according to Brown's 2012 technical report, there were really no diagnostic shifts in the soil to infer a natural stratification across the site. And as a result, he dug in 5 by 5 feet units down to a tenth of a foot levels using engineering rulers in an attempt to really base stratification of the site on the presence or absence of artifacts, which unfortunately was not uniformed across the site from block to block or within blocks from cabin to cabin. Having come to the Levi Jordan Plantation assemblage with scholarship primarily focused on the antebellum era, I wanted to see if I could tease out the antebellum and postbellum time periods to see if that were possible. And typically, historical archaeological sites that date to the 17th through the 19th centuries in the Atlantic world tend to focus on shifts in ceramic production as a means of relatively dating sites. And as we enter into the 20th century, the onset of automatic machine bottles makes technological shifts in glass production a more diagnostic attribute in early 20th century sites well into the 1950s. However, in-depth diagnostic attributes of ceramics at the Levi Jordan plantation were never fully recorded beyond ceramic ware types, which were limited to porcelain, whiteware, and stoneware, and no diagnostic information on decoration types such as hand-painted, transferred print, genre even within that, decal, shell, feather edge molding were given, all of which would have provided more information for seriation of the site based on the frequency of artifact of ceramic attributes. And of course, I ran into the same problem examining glass within the database. There was such a lack of diagnostic attributes pertaining to glass, including manufacturing technique, decoration type, etc. It made these two traditional artifact classes for relative dating unreliable. And as a result, I turned to the distribution of wire nails with the TPQ of 1885 and cut nails to establish a late post 1885 and early period at the site, using an abundance indices with ceramics as a baseline from which to draw proportions of other artifact classes demonstrated slight proportional shifts in different artifact classes across the site for beads, buttons, glass, and fauna. However, with wire nails signifying the onset of the late period, it ultimately means that quite a bit of material culture in the early phase could actually be post 1865. We know from the settlement of the plantation in 1848 to the destruction of the quarters area in 1910 based on aerial photographs that the occupation of the blocks was about 50 years. In establishing an early and late period, while not directly correlating to the antebellum and postbellum time frame, has demonstrated shifts in distributions of particular artifact classes over time, more of which I speak on during a discussion of my interpretations of the site. I'm going to shift now from the site background to really orient us within the post-emancipation era. I opened this section of the presentation with a quote from Maria Snyder, an ex-enslaved woman who labored and lived in Texas, and a circa 1895 photograph of African-American men, women, and children picking cotton in Georgia. Mariah stated, quote, "We wore low clothes and I never seen no other kind of dress till after surrender," end quote. Within the captured sepia tones of the stereoscope are the complexities of racial, gender, class, and age realities experienced by African American farmers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Women are dressed in gowns fastened with hook and eyes and buttons, along with gingham blouses that match their patterned headscarves. These were coupled with coarse cotton petticoats fashioned with light-toned aprons. Dried cotton bristles pricked at the flesh of these laborers as they picked bolls of cotton that were placed in the bottoms of sacks that were slung over their shoulders. This labor was not gendered. Everyone labored in what seemed like endless fields of white cotton or green sugarcane stalks and coffee plants. Men were dressed in dark trousers, which were held up with tin and copper alloy belt buckles, as well as suspender fasteners. Trousers were coupled with light-colored shirts, which they then accompanied with black slouch hats. This labor also knew no age limit. It was learned by the young as soon as they were able to participate. Thus, the socialization of labor and dress passed from adults to children, as evidenced by the young girl in her gingham gown and patterned headscarf that matches the clothing of adult women picking cotton nearby. The young girl stands next to a nearly full wicker basket that reaches to her waist, adding what she could to the collection. Surrender, as Mariah Snyder called the emancipation of roughly 4 million African Americans in 1865, marked the start of the Reconstruction era, which brought with it new challenges and opportunities. In Snyder's works, Progress Administrative Ex-Slave Narrative, she notes clear differences in sartorial practices from the antebellum and postbellum eras. Lowell clothes, named after the Lowell mills that sprung up in the Northeast, were made of cotton coarse cloth that the enslaved were provided by plantation owners and were often produced on site by enslaved seamstresses. The cloth provided was plain in design, and a great deal of knowledge and skill was needed on the part of seamstresses, and decoration and stylization often came from the enslaved who, throughout many WPA narratives, recount the myriad of ways they dyed their clothes with sweet gum bark and sumac berries to align with personal aesthetics. The postbellum era brought with it the rise of consumer culture and different avenues of market accessibility that contributed to opportunities for newly emancipated Africans to engage in different sartorial practices within the bounds of economic and geographic access, while they navigated racial and gendered subjugation in their everyday lives. It is the buttons, buckles, and hook and eyes, along with hair combs and jewelry, which are a testament to the ways tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and wage laborers who lived and worked at the Levi Jordan plantation during the postbellum era engaged in sartorial practices. Within historical archaeological scholarship on adornment, the multivariant meanings behind artifacts recovered in the archaeological record that relate to dress practices are tools for the formation of identities. Identity analysis within the field of archaeology provides the foundation of adornment studies, paving an avenue for historical archaeologists to interpret past formations of identity by critically examining the small things, to pull from Carolyn White and Mary Boutry. Beads, buttons, rivets, suspenders, bodices, hairpins, and hook and eyes are some of the small things that, along with documentary data, can serve as evidence of iterative practices pulling from the Miskill's work that make up sartorial practices of self-making engaged by individuals. And doing this work really required applying an analytical framework that centered on the intersecting operations of race, gender, and class that structured the social lives of Black women in the past. The theoretical framework that guides this research, as mentioned earlier, is Kimberly Crenshaw's Theorization of Intersectionality, which locates the positionality of Black women at the intersections of race, gender, and class operations of power and oppression. Intersectionality is the crux of Black feminist theory. As Patricia Hill Collins writes, this theoretical framework works to treat race, class, gender, and sexuality less as personal attributes and more as systems of domination in which the individuals construct unique identities. Intersectional analysis illuminates axes of power and oppression that construct African American women's past and present formations of identity. This theoretical approach aims to engender examinations of African American history that at all times accounts for the multiple facets of identity and the ways they come to shape past social lives. As Patricia Hill Collins' work, Black Feminist Thought, um, and while Patricia Hill Collins' work, Black Feminist Thought, has really canonized Black feminist theory within archaeological spaces, her work is really built atop a history of words from Black women who for centuries have spoken about their social locations in society and have produced a wealth of information from enslaved women to owners of beauty shops. Additionally, the work of renowned anthropologists such as Zora Neale Hurston and Catherine Dunham have long centered the lived experiences of Black women in their anthropological scholarship. And although Black feminist scholarship has made significant inroads within anthropology over the last 2 decades. And you can start by reading Arma McLaren's Black Feminist Archaeology, which was published in 2001. Historical archaeology as a subdiscipline has not expanded to widely use this framework except for a few. And Black feminist theory within archaeological scholarship, as I mentioned, is fairly new, less than 20 years old. And it's the centering of intersectionality that differentiates Black feminism historically from that of mainstream feminist scholarship in the discipline. And it's the latter that really sets the foundation for most gender analysis within the field of historical archaeology. A small group of Black archaeologists, primarily Black women, have began asking how applications of Black feminist thought could aid in the interpretation of African American past lived experiences in ways that did not compartmentalize multiple facets of Black women's experiences, but rather interpreted them as wholly complex. The possibilities that Black feminist theory affords to archaeological scholarship on identity formation is far-seeing, and the wealth of information to be gained from such an approach has hardly been explored. Black feminist archaeology illuminates how the act of historicizing the positionality of past individuals has to account for the specificity of past operations of race, gender, and class, which are shifting both temporally and spatially across time. Through our implementation of Black feminist framework, I asked how processes of racialization, sexual exploitation, and economic disenfranchisement converge and diverge to shape sartorial practices of self-making among African American women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's through this framework that I demonstrate how axes of power and oppression impacted and shaped social lives of past Black women, and the legacies of which can still be seen today. The implementation of a Black feminist framework within historical archaeology creates space for dehomogenizing studies of identity. And the work of Boudry and of Mullins really cautions against archaeological scholarship on identity in the quest for specificity, running the risk of essentializing human experiences. Black feminism really revels in the complexity of human existence, demanding that controlling images of Black women, stereotypes attached to Black female bodies, laced with social historical ties to racism and sexism, are questioned and complicated. Situating itself within Black feminist archaeology, my work really calls for scholars to take seriously quotidian practices engaged by African Americans and the material culture used to perform those practices as sites for the production of knowledge. And while Black feminist archaeology was conceived within the bounds of African diasporic archaeology, its focus on the quiet really pushes against the foundation of its parentage. Early African diasporic archaeological research, conducted primarily at 18th and 19th century plantation sites, were mainly focused on the search for Melville Hertzkovitz's conceptualization of Africanisms. And Africanisms were thought to be these loud, analogous connections between material culture found at African diasporic sites in the Americas to ethnic groups on the continent of Africa. And while scholarship within African diaspora archaeology has since expanded beyond the quest for Africanisms, the residuum of its foundations are still seen in how artifacts that speak to the everyday, the quiet, are often devalued and overlooked. The proposed work that I'm doing now really offers a critical intervention within the field of African diasporic archaeology through its centering of the quotidian and quiet practices of self-making. So a bit about the data analyzed for this project. I examined 2,860 artifacts related to clothing, adornment, hygiene, grooming, and clothing maintenance. And what this really amounted to was 2,231 buttons, 392 artifacts classified as jewelry, a classification comprised of wire, pendant, earrings, chain, watches, brooch fragments, along with 276 beads. Additionally, I examined 63 hair comb fragments, 11 hook and eye fasteners, and 160 clothing maintenance artifacts, including straight pins, safety pins, a bodkin, sewing needles, an owl, and thimbles. And within this project, material culture data is placed in conversation with both documentary and oral history data, census records, the Levi Jordan Plantation postbellum papers, historic advertisements from Montgomery Wade, as well as Sears and Roebuck catalogs, along with oral history collections gathered by Cheryl White in the early 1990s and by Maria Franklin during the early 2000s to provide additional historical context that further illustrates the lived experiences of African Americans during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Texas. And finally, historical photographs are used to really gauge clothing trends during the post-emancipation era. And I've taken a particular interest to stereo views from the late 19th and early 20th century. You can see a couple here on the slide from my personal collection. Ordinarily, photography of African Americans from the mid-19th to the early 20th century typically are portrait photographs where fancier dress practices are typically engaged or imposed upon. The images on the slides are examples once again from my personal collection. However, stereo views were great at documenting quotidian dress practices of African Americans, producing finite detail regarding sartorial practices over time. And this, of course, is within its own limitations, which I'd be happy to discuss further during the Q&A section. The representation of everyday dress practices seen in stereo views initially drew me to the photographs. What got me hooked on them was the technology that created them, which, when viewed through a stereoscope viewer, and ordinarily when it's not COVID times and I'm actually doing this presentation in person, I have not only the collection of stereo views that I own, but also a stereo viewer so that audience members can actually witness this firsthand. But really got me hooked on the images was really the technology that created them. So when viewed through a stereoscope viewer, it transforms a 2D image into a 3D image, producing immersive photographic experiences where viewers can see the site as if they were there and could actually reach out and touch those that are being photographed. I have a few examples here on the slide from the New York Public Library, which created an online tool called the Stereograminator that transforms historical stereographs into shareable 3D web formats. Additionally, the California Museum of Photography hosts one of the largest collections of Keystone and Mass stereo views from the 19th and 20th century. So really think 19th century virtual reality technology that produced finite details regarding sartorial style and type, and for my particular research, the use and popularity of particular clothing fashions over time. So focusing on everyday modalities of being as spaces where constructions of Black womanhood were formed, my examination of material culture data, along with documentary and oral history data, focused specifically on the ways sartorial practices were shaped by the matrix of domination within spheres of labor, as well as due to the threat of racial sexual violence, desires for self-expression, and processes of social reproduction in complex ways. So returning to my first question, I initially asked, given the relationship between fashion and constructions of hegemonic notions of femininity, how are women really navigating the matrix of domination through their sartorial practices? And throughout the book, I really argue that constructions of Black womanhood were embedded in relations and ideologies of race, gender, and class. And further, Black women as historical agents negotiated these operations of power and oppression negotiated these operations of power and oppression through dress within the context of labor, violence, social reproduction, and just as significantly dress, desire, and creativity. Given the relationship between fashion and hegemonic notions of femininity, my interpretation suggests that women's clothing and adornment practices were representative of the complex entanglement of resistance and conformity to these notions. The clothing African American women wore while doing agricultural labor was tied to negotiations of femininity, the realities of racial, gender, and class subjugation, and the necessity of functional clothing needed for rural Southern agricultural labor. Although African American women tended to land, cooked over hearths, sewed and mended and washed clothing, gendered ideology about women's appropriate dress was so influential that Black women adhered to it even when their clothing were often impractical for the kinds of work they had to do. The clothing African American women wore was incredibly restrictive for the kinds of labor that they did have to perform. Within the project, I attempt to really move away from the binary notions of resistance versus conformity by acknowledging that African American women in their constructions of identity occupy a space of contradiction, really pulling from Toni Morrison. Because Black women are outsiders within, pulling from Patricia Hill Collins, they dress themselves and live their lives in ways that illustrate the simultaneity of being women, yet outside of the normalized ideas of femininity and womanhood. The palimpsest or layers of histories of oppression written onto their flesh position them outside what is deemed acceptable. As a result, African American women and their dress practices are neither fully liberating nor completely oppressive. Rather, their experiences were complex negotiations of power and how to maintain one's dignity and personhood and define oneself during this time period. I argue that Black womanhood is distinctive in so much as African American women, within the multiplicity of their social experiences, have a shared history of oppression written onto their flesh that impacts their constructions of identity. Thus, Black womanhood was both individually as well as collectively asserted. And the evidence for jewelry as a form of adornment, in particular the use of beads, is one line of evidence that may speak to this dynamic. And rather than highlight a particular bead color or jewelry type, and bead color specifically has like roots within African diasporic archaeology that appears in fire and higher frequencies across the site. I focus instead on the wide variety of both, really interpreting this as a desire for self-expression among African Americans at the site that also falls within traditional African American aesthetics of bold and contrasting color schemes. This African American aesthetic is historically evidenced most widely in Black women's quilting traditions and textile trends seen in clothing. I suggest that diversity in button and bead color allowed African Americans to distinguish themselves collectively from white America while simultaneously expressing individualism within group dynamics. And finally, returning to my second question, I asked how African American women move through various spaces at home, at work, and in public spaces during a time of heightened racial oppression, and how were their choices regarding dress influenced? Really thinking through how their choices of clothing and adornment were situational to the spaces that they occupied. I want to answer this question by returning to the early 20th century image of Hester Holmes, who, as an enslaved woman, labored at the Levi Jordan plantation in the main house and remained as a house servant after emancipation. She's wearing a short gown fastened with buttons and a dark colored petticoat, likely tied with ribbon or fastened with hook and eyes around her waist. Her hair is pulled back and covered in a headscarf. Her hands are interlaced as she stares back at us. Her attire sits as a representation of how she maintained the Jordan home, clean and modest. I look at Hester and I wonder how our Black women's choices in dress situationally shaped. As African American women occupied spaces at home, at work, and in public during a heightened time of racial oppression, their choices regarding dress were extremely impacted by racialized and gendered violence. The threat of white terrorism against African Americans increased during the postbellum era. Within the post-emancipation era, tactics of social control and surveillance, sumptuary laws similar to those of the colonial era had a resurgence in the South, and practices of dressing down became foundational to survival for African Americans as they moved across the Texas landscape. I interpreted this as a possible situational dress practice engaged by African Americans at the Levi Jordan plantation, evidenced by the high percentages of plain clothing fashioners recovered at the site. And while this could, of course, be reflective of a restricted market accessibility and poverty, I'd like to highlight once again that the Levi Jordan plantation was located along the Brazos River, providing both Black and white residents access to a wide variety of goods. Additionally, there are slightly higher discard rates of decorated ceramic vessels from the late period at the site, suggesting that African American residents had the means to purchase more costly ceramic goods. However, there is a decrease in the discard rates of more costly clothing fasteners, such as glass buttons and one-hole bone buttons, which were used in the production of more costly cloth-covered fasteners, and a slight increase in the discard rates of plain ceramic and metal buttons. And I argue that the prevalence of plain clothing fasteners may be indicative of a desire to dress down as a means of addressing the threat of racial gendered violence of the time. Specific to African American women who worked as domestic servants, dress practices engaged in while laboring in the homes of white employers reflected modesty and cleanliness. Building on this interpretation, it should be noted, oops, Give me 1 second. My PowerPoint just shut off. See if I can pull that back up. There we go. My apologies. Specific to African American women who worked as domestic servants, dress practices engaged in while laboring in the homes of white employers reflected modesty and cleanliness. And really building on this interpretation, it should be noted that the act of dressing the body daily, physically adding layers of cloth, tying knots with ribbon to secure clothing, alongside with the tedious nature of fastening numerous hook and eyes, could have acted as an armor preventing increased access to the physical body by requiring additional labor. And the desire to dress in particular ways while laboring in white spaces was in part a response to the threat of racial sexual violence Black women faced from their white employers, as Black women pushed against controlling images of the hypersexualized Black feminine body through modesty. However, we know that regardless of what women were wearing, the external threat of violence towards their bodies was ever present. What's important to note is that white homes were dangerous spaces for Black women who were forced to meet the expectations of their white employers in terms of their appearance, including their dress, in order to hold on to their jobs and to de-escalate their visibility. So the application of Black feminist theory in this research really advocates for alternative theoretical approaches within the field of archaeology to address the multiplicity of identity formations in the past as a means of writing a more inclusive history of post-emancipated Texas. Avenues for future exploration of Black feminist archaeology's depths in the field are really far-reaching, and intersectionality, the crux of Black feminist thought, has permeated the realms of archaeology, providing scholars new interpretive frameworks within the realm of historical archaeology. Intersectional research has really birthed expansive theoretical, methodologically robust scholarship, examining the spatial and temporal specificities of operations of power and oppression. And Black feminist thought within archaeology, once again, has been used to study things such as the lived experiences of enslaved African diasporic women from 18th century plantanocracies of the Americas to studies examining the intersections between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans in prehistoric Europe. In 2017, the annual Society for Historic Archaeology conference, a symposium was created that was titled Intersectionality as Emancipatory Archaeology. And I participated in the symposium, which featured topics on archaeology, which featured wide varying topics such as archaeological education in K-12 settings, explorations of whiteness and reproductive health, as well as the contemporary archaeological studies of garbage to understand present social dynamics in North America. So it's really exciting to see the far-reaching capabilities of this particular framework in our field. Thank you. And I look forward to answering any questions or really being in dialogue with folks.
Okay, so at this point, we invite participants to add questions to the Q&A. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can upvote those to kind of make questions that you want to see answered rise to the top. While people are taking some time to put their questions into the Q&A, I do have a question to start out. When you were the slide that you had where you were going through the different houses in terms of the artifact frequencies, I think it was house 2B1 had a much larger assemblage than some of the other ones. And I was wondering if that kind of reflects maybe emerging differentiation between households. Is this kind of like a post-war phenomenon in the context of like wage labor and access to consumer goods and kind of consumer culture?
Definitely. So I'm really looking at the various sort of cabins within the blocks to really do that sort of intra-comparative analyses to sort of think through what could be the differences in people's sort of lived experiences in each of these spaces. And a lot of the early work really focused on perhaps thinking about various sort of roles that different members of the community would have held, be it elders or carvers, maybe seamstresses. But not a lot of work was really taken looking at the overall sort of assemblages rather than focusing on specific artifact classes. So I'm not only trying to think about differences in people's lived experiences, but also really trying to get at how these different spaces were occupied and then abandoned. And that work is really ongoing. So I've been doing a lot of work with the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, really doing the sort of tedious process of transferring or translating really the archaeolocal database that I was provided with into a more standardized format that can then be placed in conversation with other sites in their database to really have these conversations across the site, but also comparative to other sites in the South. So the answer is coming.
Thank you. So we have one question here from Joyce Marcus, who asks, what are your most surprising findings about buttons in the range of personal choices made by women?
Well, one of my most surprising findings, I would say, specifically with the Levi Jordan plantation, clothing and adornment artifacts um, are often recovered in such small quantities at archaeological sites. So the Levi Jordan plantation, the sheer number of clothing and adornment artifacts is really quite astounding, which provides a wide sort of sampling of a variety of different choices that were made during that time. Also, in regards to what was available. So early on in my research, I was doing a lot of work really thinking through, as this is the turn of the 20th century and the rise of mass consumer culture, what people had access to. And one thing that I came across was that one of the earliest sort of warehouses that was built outside of its initial sort of construction in the north for Sears and Roebuck was built in Texas primarily to address the sheer amount of consumers that were in the area. And I feel like, you know, the wide variety of adornment fasteners that we're finding, especially these really beautiful carved shell buttons, these really beautiful cut glass and glass inlet buttons that would have gone with a lot of more fancier dress practices. I'm trying to do the work of actually seeing where those fasteners are coming up across the site to think through how dressing down may have been a practice that was used in sort of interfacing outside of the plantation. But what did it actually look like to be amongst and in a group and feel safer to put, you know, dress out for your Sunday best in particular ways. So that work is ongoing. But I think the most surprising thing for me, of course, has just been the sheer value of clothing and adornment artifacts, which once again speaks and presses against this notion that I've often come across when I introduce my work, that because we're dealing with tenant sharecropping and wage laboring African Americans post 1865, that there was a material deprivation. And of course, economic disenfranchisement and racial violence was very real. And it's really interesting to see the ways in which people were still invested in particular consumer practices around dress and wanting to present themselves and see themselves in a particular way.
So we have another question. This one's from Jess Beck, who asks, I'm curious about who was taking the stereoscopic images that you referred to and the context they were taken in. Were these very common in the early 20th century, or are they relatively rare finds?
Yeah, so thanks for your question, Jess. I came across the stereo views because I was trying to find documentary evidence I can place an actual image in conversation with what was being recovered from the site. And a lot of what I was coming across, especially in a lot of the digital databases that are available to us, like Emory University has a fantastic online database, Cornell has a fantastic online database of just African American photographs. But I was really interested in images that weren't portrait photographs. And stereo views did that. When I came across them, I was like, oh, wow, these are turn of the 20th century images of Black folks who are doing agricultural labor, who are in their actual quarter areas, oftentimes working as tenant and sharecropping farmers. And to answer Jess's question about, if they were rare or not, they weren't. It's interesting that they're not studied more, which is something that I'm also looking into, is why they aren't studied as much as other forms of photography. You could open up a Sears and Roebuck catalog from 1895 and not only be able to see the wide variety of stereo viewers that were available to customers, but also wide varieties of collections of stereoscopes that were also available to individuals. In the book, I focus more so on these collections of agricultural production, because they're part of a collection, or they often are found in collections that center on trying to educate the public about specific regions. So there'd be a sort of collection of Georgia history, Georgia information, a collection on Texas history, Texas information, and they would talk about the agricultural products that are then exported from that particular area. And it's interesting to me that in order for them to have that conversation, it could not have been conceived of without the presence of Black bodies laboring in those spaces. So I talk about that, but then I also talk about how with the advent and sort of popularity now of virtual technology, it blows my mind that the stereo views were 20th century virtual reality, and really were designed to allow people to experience a variety of different places from the comfort of their homes. But also a lot of these images are akin to the agricultural ones, but are also more in the vein of like traditional anthropological photographs as well, that really do the work of exoticizing and codifying otherness around the world. So I'm also thinking about what it means to actually want to view and be in a space that is quote unquote different or otherwise, to think about, early technologies of seeing that codified Blackness during the time. So that's, I hope that answered your question, Jess.
Sorry about that quick interruption, real quick. So
No problem. I can hit up Alicia Miller's question around reuse. A lot of the artifacts that are recovered from the Libre, or rather, the more data has been recovered from mortuary contexts of enslaved and post-emancipated sort of free sites around reuse among different clothing fasteners. So you can often see there's a really great work that came out in 2019 by Maria Franklin that was looking at specific mortuary contexts, where you could see that one particular garment would have a variety of different buttons, and that was attributed to the fact that clothing fasteners were often reused a number of times. And Mike asked, has the plantation been damaged by any recent hurricanes? I don't know if you wanted me to answer, if you wanted to sort of, okay. Oh my goodness. As far as I know, there's no actually standing structures standing structures, pertaining to the enslaved and later free quarters area at the Levi Jordan plantation that have been impacted by the recent hurricanes. Now, the other site that I work at in St. Croix is the Estate Little Princess, which is an 18th century Danish sugar plantation. And we're excavating in the enslaved village area there. And that plantation has been deeply impacted, as many African diasporic sites across the Caribbean have been impacted, not only by hurricanes, but climate change in general, which is, creating hotter waters, creating worse hurricanes, but also just eroding coastal lines as well. And, putting a lot of historical sites, both of the African diaspora as well as Amerindian sites and prehistoric sites, in a lot of trouble. So it's an ongoing question.
Great. So we have another question. This one is from Rebecca Zurier. Wouldn't stereo card images be informed by photographers' search for typical scenes to be collected by armchair travelers? I'm thinking of Writing on Stereo Views of Black Subjects by Anthony W. Lee.
Yeah, Rebecca, I would suggest picking up Tina Camp's Listening to Images if you haven't already. One of the reasons why I love this text is because she's also looking at images that were taken. They weren't stereo views, but they were taken during the 19th century by armchair anthropologists, really, codifying otherness and taking very anthropological images of particular ethnic and tribal groups around the world. And I love and do acknowledge the limitations of the archives that we come in contact with, and the fact that they were produced oftentimes by white creators, be it in this case white photographers. But I don't want that to limit the interpretation we can have of these particular images and what can be gauged and analyzed from them. So really thinking through Tina Camp's work around listening to images and thinking about the sort of deepening understandings of Blackness that can be gauged even by thinking through what sort of technologies we're seeing were available, I think is very important. So to answer your question, yes, the images themselves were created to not only create a sort of typical view of what is perceived as Blackness, but I oftentimes in my interpretive practice come to it thinking through how the subjects in that space also averted, like were able to avert and negotiate, agency within the sort of within the limitations of the actual framing and the actual frame of the photograph. So that's really sort of what I'm playing with right now with stereo views. But I'd be really glad to read your work because, like I mentioned, there's not a lot of work being done on stereo views, and they were widely distributed throughout the late 19th century. And I think it's really important to sort of think through why certain images gained more traction than others, because you can also see, as we do with a variety of different ceramic types, how different companies are competing with one another to sort of outbet the best sort of images. So you have a number of different photographs like that King's cotton photograph, and a number of different ones that follow afterwards from different companies attempting to also create images of Blackness and sell images of Blackness to particular audiences.
We have a question here from Penelope Green. Were you able to compare fasteners from the Plantation House with the fasteners from the cabins? If so, how did they differ?
Yeah, so the artifact assemblage itself, not a lot of work was actually done at the Plantation Home. Ken Brown focused the majority of his research at the quarters area, and even now, new work at the Red Jordan Plantation is also still excavating in the quarters area. So that work hasn't been done, and the data set is not nearly as vast as what we have access to right now.
Sorry about that. I was muted. But there are no more questions in the queue, so maybe give it like a couple seconds. If there are no more questions, then okay. Well, yeah. Well, thank you for that great talk and for answering our questions about it. I don't want to keep you too long because you have an engagement after this, and it might be nice for you to actually have some time in between talks today. But thank you very much. We really appreciate it, and thank you to all who attended. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, for the opportunity and for all the labor on the back end, really ensuring that I sent you my bio and topic on time. So I appreciate all your labor.
All righty. Well, we can